Here we have a man with a very interesting name, Pollaiuolo. This artist, like a number of others in the Renaissance, and here we're Renaissance is in full swing. I think this is wrong, by the way. It's actually oil on wood. What Pollaiuolo is doing here, it looks a little phony. Now, the scene itself is rather grotesque. Here's a saint being martyred, and apparently people came up with all sorts of interesting ways of killing off people who had the wrong religion. In this case, they hung him up on a post, and they were shooting arrows into him. Not a very pleasant scene to either endure or observe. But the reason it looks a little phony, well, take a look. We have such a symmetrical arrangement here. The position of this man is echoed in the position of this man, and they even hold the bow the same way. And this is echoed by a person on the opposite side. It's unlikely that they would arrange themselves in quite such a symmetrical manner. But now we have even another to show you that he could do equally well drawing a person from the back side as well as from the front side. So quite conveniently, we have these two doing almost a dance here around each other, each taking the same action, but facing different ways. Well, what was happening here? He was interested in meeting a few rules. Perhaps symmetry was big on his mind, still a carryover from the Middle Ages. This idea that the central figure should form here kind of a pyramid was also prevalent at the time. But notice, he has used here atmospheric perspective, and it would appear even focused perspective, in attempting to show some depth in this scene. And notice the small figure here, noticeably smaller than the figures in the mid-range. Some use of linear perspective is being employed also. Now, Gombrich makes a criticism of this area here. How do we get from this point to the back? I don't find that much of a problem with it. It does seem to be rather natural in that way. It actually was an attempt to make use of Renaissance concepts, but this carryover of symmetry seems to have permeated the artist's thinking. Now, Botticelli. Here we have something that's notable in a number of ways. We see a departure here, first of all, from religious art. This is Venus. This is part of Roman mythology. Venus having arrived on the scene, having been drifting in from the ocean on this large clamshell, and the winds sort of pushing her here, blowing this way to push her to shore. Well, what's significant about this is the fact that this is one of the examples where in the Renaissance, the subject matter that artists chose to portray had started to branch out. It was no longer a commission from the church that instigated this artwork. It was a commission from a wealthy person. This was a decoration in the man's home. In addition, this is very significant for the fact that when you look at the curved surfaces of the body here, you really do get the sense of curvature because of the way that the light shading has worked. Dark here, light here, because light seems to be coming from this direction. Now, a few phony things about this. The waves look a little bit kind of strange. I mean, they don't look particularly realistic. But that's not the main point here. The main point is what the artist has done is to make a body that's very beautiful and to make it realistic in its shape. You sense that this is more than a flat image. If you compared this to some of the images from the Middle Ages, of course, the Middle Ages were not concerned with this way of representing a human body. This is much more in the vein of Greek statuary, where the body will show all of its curves. On the other hand, the more you look at this, the more you see something you may not have seen earlier. This woman's neck is rather long. It's almost as if to get this sinuous curve in here, he had to somehow make the head fit to the body in a way that maybe is a little bit unrealistic. This is a well-renowned piece of art, though, for all the groundbreaking that it did. And now here we have an interesting thing with the Illuminated manuscript from the late 1400s, the 15th century. The thing that's interesting about this, and there's a few things actually, first of all, this is the text that's actually on the page of this hand-lettered book, this hand-lettered manuscript. This is the reason for the page being here. But you'll notice it's almost entirely been crowded out by illustrations. First of all, there's even an illustration here that's probably related to what this text is talking about specifically. But even here we have a lot of decoration crowded in. The more we look at the surroundings of this, though, the more we're taken by the fact that there are so many illustrations here that really dominate the appearance practically every square inch of this that isn't covered by some sort of a design this way or little angels is covered by some sort of a picture that probably also in some way relates to this text. But that's not where it ends. Even more, if you take a look here, the scene of the Annunciation. Interesting, it's drawn as if it were taking place in the kind of a building that probably existed at that time. Makes the scene more realistic, but even beyond that, there's something else going on here. It's in this area here. What's happening? There's an open window dominating the scene, and in it we see a landscape. Let's compare this to a manuscript that would have been done not that many years earlier. Here we see a Psalter from the prior century. That's a prayer book from 1310, and here we see 1474, so about 150, 160 years. What a fantastic difference between these two. Here we see medieval concepts of the placement of figures, the use of gestures, but very flat artwork. No attempt really here to portray any depth at all. The business of this illustration was simply to convey this religious story. Although we did see earlier that some decoration was applied even of a common scene from life. Now take a look. 160 years later, we have this going on, and very great sense of depth because linear perspective is being used here in a very major way. What kind of perspective do you see going on here? Now let's take a look at that much larger. What you see happening here is linear perspective fading off into the distance here. Things have gotten smaller, but you'll see atmospheric perspective in a major way. This is all bluish. Now it's hard to see whether there's any focus perspective going on here, but given the nature of this is an illuminated manuscript. It's a missal, so it means it's involved in religious worship. But it's been done with such an emphasis here of realism that it's totally different in terms of the impression it gives from this earlier work that was done for the same purpose. By this time, 1474, the Renaissance is in full swing, and artists working in many different mediums, in many different types of artwork, are beginning to explore and implementing these techniques of realism and perspective. And that's the end of the slides for Chapter 13.